So hi, I'm Dan, and this is something a little bit different today. For the last couple of weeks, I've been working on a lot of NES style art. I like working on NES style art a lot. I've done it a few times, and in the past, a few people have asked me like how I make such vibrant, good-looking NES style art, and you see a few of my mock-ups on the screen right there. And I didn't have a venue really to do this before when people have asked me, but now I have a YouTube channel where I talk about game design. I thought, hey, how about I do just a brief introduction into how to make pretty looking NES style art. Now, an important thing to talk about here right now is that the NES's actual technical capabilities were very, very limited. And when I do NES style art, I don't rigidly adhere to those limitations very much. But if you're like one of my friends using NESmaker or any other way you're trying to make actual NES ROMs or games for actual NES hardware, you are going to need to rigidly adhere to the NES's technical limitations. I'm going to try and cover both staying in the vague style of NES art and like the rigid adherence to NES limitations. If you've worked with NES style stuff before, you've probably seen this color palette. Um, as a selection of colors, it's pretty good. It's why there's a lot of good looking NES games, but the way it's laid out is so obviously created by programmers and not artists. What I'm going to start you off with is laying out the colors like this. There's a color wheel. If you do art a lot, you've probably seen colors laid out like this before. If you are designing for NES specifically, here's what that looks like with all the specific color values in there. Feel free to take a screen grab. You might have seen this before because I've shared it a few times before. So why are we doing a color wheel? Now, the reason I have this laid out like a wheel, like this, is there's a few different patterns that are used a lot for making good-looking color palettes. And a wheel is a good way to visualize those. A good example, like here from Castlevania, is complementary. That's when colors are directly across from each other on the color palette. It has orangey yellow tones and bluey tones directly across from each other. Another example, like the screen grab here from Mega Man 5, is split tones. It's like complementary, where you'd have one directly across from each other, but instead of directly across, you split it like this with the blue and the purple. You could also, like, debatably argue that this is an example of the next one. The next example here is from Batman the NES game. This is a triadic, where you have a triangle of colors: red, green, blue. And my next example is from Kirby's Adventure. They use square, which basically, you know, two complementaries across from each other. So you have the yellow, the blue, the purple, and the green. Forms a square. There's another one called Rectangle. I wasn't able to find a good NES game example of, but that would be basically two split tones across from each other, like a complementary, but you see my screen grab there. You see what I'm talking about. So a lot of NES games obviously already use this sort of technique, but it has its limitations. So we're gonna bring up. So here I have the colors visualized more rainbowy. It's kind of like how I have them set up in the corner right there. It's fine. This works, and just following those simple patterns are going to get you pretty good looking art off the bat. But we can kick this up a little bit. So if I create, just a ball here. It looks fine. Looks like a P. That's fine. But it looks a little boring. And this because just having all the colors in the same hue isn't really how colors naturally look in the real world. And you may have seen this tree I've had in the background. And the reason for that So you notice in the highlights here, the color is more yellow toned and the shadows is more blue toned. In natural outdoor light, the sun shines off what we perceive as yellow light. It's not yellow light, technically, physics is complicated. Whereas the blue sky gives off an ambient blue light, so objects will tend to have yellow highlights and blue shadows. It's not always the case, but we're going to go with that for a second. Instead of having it look like this, took a more bluish tone for the shadow and a more yellowish tone for the highlight. It looks much more dynamic. It looks a lot more like what it would look like in natural lighting. So what we could do is we could, offset these colors by each other, except we're not going to do that because I already did that, and I already did it the other way. So this is our color palettes with the highlights yellow toned and the shadows blue toned. I don't have the yellow here because any shift from yellow would be less yellow, and I don't have the blue here because any shift from blue would be less blue. There are reasons you'd want to use the other color palettes. I'm going to get into those. So, we talked about color palettes. We talked about yellow tone highlights and blue tone shadows. How do we make this look good? All right, so let's look at one of my examples. This one here. This uses a square tone. It might not be obvious at first, but I'm using the green, I'm using the purple in the flowers, I'm using the blue in the river, and I'm using the yellow in the tree trunk and the shore. So that gives us a square tone. It's kind of subtle, but it looks nice. You see all the contrasts. This example here also uses the square. I believe it's blue, purple, and green. I don't have the other one because, you don't actually have to use all four if you're using a square palette, but because if you're designing for NES, you have actual NES hardware, you have a lot of limitations in the amount of palettes you can actually use. And I actually have a little trick for that one right here. Whereas this looks like it uses a four tone, it's the magenta, blue, cyan, yellow square palette. But I actually put the yellow and the cyan in the same palette. That lets me save a palette. So if you're designing for NES, you can preserve a palette for your HUD, which you will probably want to do. And I did mention earlier that there's reasons you might not always want to use the yellow highlight and blue shadow. This example right here is why you'd want to do that. Is this one you can see I use the blue highlight and a more, this one it looks purpley, but it's more yellow toned. And much like how the sun gives off the yellow highlight, at night the moon gives off a blue highlight, and like street lights or campfires, whatever, will give off yellow ambient light. So you'd actually end up having a reverse of what we showed earlier. You'd have this right there. These are the sorts of palettes you would want to use if you're making a scene that's at night or is cold. And the way you do it is going to depend a lot on your setting. Like interior areas would just have a lot less pronounced differences entirely. Take this as a rough guideline, not like a hard rule you have to follow. Okay, so how about, for just some practice, let's create an NES color palette. So let's say I want to create a forest scene. I like the screen here. And if I wanted to do a triadic, I take the red there and let's say this blue. That's a good triadic. The red can work for, tree trunks, leaves on ground. The blue could work for water or the sky. Now, if you're designing for the NES specifically, you do not get to have 4 colors in every palette. When I do NES style art, I tend to use the 4. If you're using NES Maker, something like that, you don't get to. What I recommend doing is picking one of the darker colors and making that your background that's shared by all the palettes. I picked the green here because, again, a forest. Um, the bluer tone would also work, but not as well. So that gives more, it gives autumny vibes. This could work for an autumn palette. But yeah, I like the green there. This is this good foresty palette. Now let's say I want to do, I don't know, I want to do a city. We'll do a city palette. And we're going to make this a square palette. So we'll start with that. We'll get that, and that. That's the square palette. How you use those colors can vary a lot, depending on what you're going for, what sort of city you're going for. I'm thinking modern city, so the blue could work for the concrete, and then you have trees and windows and promotional stuff and all that. And if we're doing NES style, NES specifically, I think this purplish toned one there works best. If you're doing NES style, you don't have to deal with that. But if you're doing NES specifically, there you go. Now, one other thing is, like, a lot of this color theory, I'm talking about hues, and it doesn't matter if something doesn't have a hue. This example I have over here, I used gray. Gray doesn't have a hue. So gray, white, or black, you can just sub in anywhere and it's going to work. It depends on exactly what you're going for. I recommend not going heavy on the grays. The best looking NES games like Kirby's Adventure or the Mega Man series or Castlevania just embraced being bright and colorful. If you're making a game for the NES, or NES style, like all the mock-ups I have here, just embrace that it's going to be bright and colorful. You can get away with a lot if you make it look like the color palettes was a deliberate choice and something not you don't want it to look like you're fighting against the NES color palette. You want to make it look like you chose this deliberately, which is what I went for in all my mock-ups here. Like, I went for a city pop style. City pop lends itself to bright and colorfulness. I went for tropical ocean. Tropical ocean lends itself to the bright and colorfulness. Just embrace it. You that's the colors you have to work with. Embrace that you're working with those colors. Yeah, that's basic color theory as applied to the NES. I might make a part 2 of this if you guys have interest in other aspects. I didn't talk about sprite size or anything like that. I was focused strictly on the colors. If you'd like to see more videos like this, put a thing in the comments and ask me questions. And I will try to make another thing, or I won't, because I don't think anyone's going to watch this. But that's fine. I will see you next time.